I never planned to spend a night anywhere near that graveyard. I only ended up there because of a stupid decision I made while trying to save money on a long trip across northern Michigan back in late autumn of 2019. I was 27 then, driving alone from Marquette toward a friend's place near a small town called Iron Ridge. The plan was simple: drive during the day, reach my friend's house before night, and stay there. But halfway through the drive, my car started overheating. I pulled over on an old county road lined with leafless trees that looked like they were waiting for something to collapse on. The nearest tow service told me they couldn't get to me until morning. I didn't want to sleep in the car in the open woods, so when I looked around and saw a narrow dirt path that cut deeper into the trees, I followed it on foot just to see if there was any kind of shelter. The path felt wrong from the start. Dead leaves were piled so thick that every step cracked loudly. The air smelled damp, like soil that hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. When I reached the clearing, I saw the graveyard first. It looked abandoned. Tilted headstones, rusted iron fencing, weeds pushing up from every gap, and no sign that anyone had been there for years. Behind the graveyard, tucked in the corner like it was trying to hide from the world, stood an old cabin. It was small, maybe one room, with a sagging roof and a front door that looked like it had been kicked more than once. I didn't like the idea of sleeping close to a graveyard, but the temperature was dropping fast. There was no phone signal where I was, and walking back to my car meant staying exposed in the cold. I went to the cabin and pushed the door open. Creaked loud enough to echo. Inside, it smelled like wet wood and dust. There was a narrow bed frame without a mattress, a broken chair, and a small table pushed against the wall. Leaves had blown in through gaps between the logs. The place felt forgotten, like even the spiders didn't bother making webs in there anymore. Still, a roof was a roof. I cleared a space on the floor, laid my jacket down as padding, and tried to settle in. I kept telling myself nothing was wrong, that the place was just old, and that fear was only coming from the graveyard outside. But as I sat there, I kept noticing things that didn't make sense. On the inside of the door, long scratch marks ran downward in deep grooves. Not animal scratches, these were straight, strong, and uneven, like someone dragged something sharp down the wood again and again. The table had mud on it, smudges that looked like someone with filthy hands had leaned on it recently. The air inside the cabin felt warmer than outside, as if someone had been there earlier in the day. I tried brushing away the thoughts. I told myself other hikers might use the place sometimes. I tried to rest, but every few minutes a new sound outside broke the silence. Light footsteps in the leaves, branches shifting, a dull thud from somewhere behind the cabin. The kind of noise you hear deep in the woods at night when animals move around, except these sounds were slow, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. Around an hour passed before I noticed something else. The smell crept in so quietly that at first I thought it was just damp mold. But then it grew stronger. It had a metallic edge to it, like rust mixed with something rotting. I tried to breathe through my sleeve, but the smell got thicker, as if the source of it was somewhere near the back wall. I stood up and looked around the cabin again. The only window was a narrow rectangle that gave me a view of the graveyard. Moonlight lit everything outside in a pale silver glow. The wind pushed through the trees, but the gravestones didn't move. They stood still like they were watching the cabin. The smell grew sharper, and something in me finally pushed past the fear. I walked to the back wall and found a small door I hadn't noticed earlier, right under the bed frame. It was low, barely big enough for a person to crawl through. I pulled it open and a wave of cold air shot out, carrying the full force of the smell. My stomach tightened. I used the flashlight on my phone and looked inside. Under the cabin was a crawl space, maybe 3 feet high, full of mud, roots, and pieces of broken boards. But that wasn't what froze me. Someone had been living under there. I saw a dirty blanket, half buried in the mud, empty cans, footprints in the soft soil, pair of torn gloves, and next to the blanket, a black duffel bag with its zipper half open. Inside the bag, I could see a metal tool, long, rusted, and sharp. The kind of thing someone could use for more than just digging. Before I could process any of it, I heard the footsteps again. But this time they were not outside. They were right next to the cabin. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I turned off my phone's light and crouched low, barely breathing. Something brushed against the cabin wall, and the wood creaked as if someone pressed their weight against it. Then, from the narrow window, a shadow passed by, a tall shape, moving silently between the gravestones. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might give me away. I backed away from the small door and closed it gently. I didn't want whoever was outside to know I found their hiding spot. I tried to think clearly. My car was too far to run to in the dark, and the woods were thick. If I left the cabin and whoever was out there saw me, I wouldn't stand a chance. The footsteps circled the cabin for what felt like forever. Sometimes they stopped. Sometimes I heard breathing, low and rough. At one point, something tapped the window, lightly, like fingers. I pressed my back against the far wall and stayed completely still. Then the doorknob moved, turned slowly, just a small shift, but enough to make the door click. I stared at it until my eyes burned. The door didn't open fully. Instead, the knob turned again, stronger this time, and the whole door shook. The person outside wasn't trying to break it down. They were testing it, checking if it was locked, seeing if whoever was inside would react. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After a few minutes, the pressure on the door stopped. The footsteps drifted toward the graveyard again, then faded. I stayed awake the entire night, not daring to shift even an inch. Every small crack of wood or rustle outside sent a jolt through my chest. I kept replaying the scene in my head, the duffel bag, the tool, the blanket, the fact that the person who lived under the cabin had come back and realized something was different. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I stood up, shoved my things into my backpack, and left the cabin without looking back. The graveyard looked even worse in the early light. The names on the stones faded, the ground uneven. I walked quickly across the clearing and followed the path back to my car. When I reached the road, the tow truck was already there. The driver asked if I slept in the car. I just nodded. I didn't mention the cabin. I didn't mention the scratch marks on the door or the bag under the floor. I didn't want to explain any of it, and I didn't want anyone asking me to show them where it was. Days later, when I checked a map, I couldn't find the graveyard marked anywhere. The path wasn't listed either. It was like the place had been forgotten on purpose. But I still think about the scratches on the door. They weren't old. Whatever made them had done it recently, maybe even the day before I arrived. And I think about the person who walked between the gravestones at night, circling the cabin again and again, checking who had dared to step into their space. I got out because they chose not to come inside. That's all. Nothing supernatural, nothing strange. Just a real person who lived where no one should live, watching from the dark, waiting to see if I would leave on my own. I did, and every time I drive at night now, I pay attention to old paths that disappear into the trees. I never follow them, no matter how desperate I am, because I know now what kind of people might be living at the end of them, waiting for the next person who thinks an abandoned cabin near a graveyard is safer than the cold. It isn't. I learned that the hard way, and I won't ever forget it. I was 28 when I decided to spend a week alone in a remote cabin in northern Minnesota. It was early October, the air already crisp, carrying the unmistakable scent of pine and fallen leaves, and I wanted nothing more than a break from the endless drone of city life. The cabin had been rented from a small family-run outfitter near Ely. They'd warned me that cell service would be spotty at best, but I didn't mind. I wanted isolation. I wasn't looking for ghosts or legends, I just needed quiet, maybe a little adventure. The drive up had taken longer than expected. The main highway gave way to long stretches of gravel roads that twisted through thick forests, with only occasional clearings revealing frozen lakes and mossy rocks. By the time I reached the small dirt path that led to the cabin, dusk had already settled, leaving everything under a muted orange and gray sky. I parked my old Jeep at the edge of a clearing, the tires crunching over loose gravel. The cabin was small, rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney with no smoke, and a single porch that sagged slightly under its own age. Its windows reflected the forest, dark and still, like black eyes staring back at me. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and aged wood, mixed with a faint tang of mildew. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with a worn wood table, and a single bedroom with a narrow bed and a thin blanket. The furnishings were basic, almost Spartan, but they felt solid, practical. I dropped my bag, ran water from the tap, and unpacked a few supplies. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the windows and bending the trees so that their branches scratched faintly against the siding. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of wind whistling through the trees. But at around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, a low, almost rhythmic thump coming from the edge of the forest. But as I strained my ears, I realized it wasn't random. It was deliberate, measured, like someone stepping carefully over fallen branches. My stomach tightened. I was alone, miles from anyone. I grabbed the small flashlight I kept on the bedside table and crept to the window. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing at first. Then I saw it. Movement among the trees. A tall figure crouched slightly, moving slowly, almost stalking. It wasn't human in the sense of someone casually walking by. It was deliberate, careful, watching. My heart was hammering in my chest. I knew I couldn't just sit there. I turned off the light and moved silently to the kitchen, where I had a small hunting knife in a drawer. Not much, but it was something. For the next hour, I stayed in the kitchen, peeking out the window when the figure moved. At one point, I thought I saw it turn and glance directly at the cabin. My mind raced. Could someone have been following me from the road? Or had they come specifically for the cabin? I had no neighbors for miles. No one would hear me if something went wrong. I kept reminding myself that most people weren't out in the forest at night for fun, and that fear can make ordinary shadows seem alive. But the sense of being watched, the deliberate movement in the trees, made rational thinking impossible. Around 4 a.m., the thumping stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, the forest was quiet, mist rising from the damp ground. I forced myself to leave the cabin, needing to confirm that no one had broken in while I slept. The porch steps were intact, the door locked, and the windows showed no signs of tampering. Still, I noticed footprints in the soft mud near the edge of the clearing. They weren't human, not entirely. They were long, uneven, and deep, almost as if a heavy animal had walked on its hind legs. My stomach sank. Whatever had been out there, it was still close. The next day, I stayed inside mostly, chopping wood for the stove and keeping the doors locked. I ate quickly, washed dishes, and tried to make sense of what I had seen. I found myself checking every shadow, every tree line, every sound. Around midday, I heard branches snapping closer to the cabin. I froze, heart racing, and then heard a low, guttural growl. Not like a dog, but something heavier, more controlled. I grabbed my flashlight and knife and edged toward the door. A large black bear came to mind immediately, but the sound didn't match any bear I had ever heard in the North Woods. It was too deliberate, too quiet in its weight. I stayed put, hoping it would move on, but the growl faded slowly, deliberately, as if testing me. By the third day, I knew I couldn't ignore the possibility of someone, or something, tracking me. I began to reinforce the cabin as best I could. I stacked extra firewood against the windows, moved furniture to block doors, and kept my flashlight and knife within reach. I kept telling myself it had to be human. The footprints were off, yes, but maybe an escaped animal or a hunting dog. Still, I refused to sleep without checking every corner of the cabin first. On the fourth day, I decided to leave for a short walk, hoping to calm my nerves. I followed a small trail toward a frozen creek. I moved slowly, listening to the wind, the crunch of leaves, and the occasional distant caw of a crow. Halfway to the creek, I stopped. The tracks were back, crossing the trail. They were the same odd, elongated shape from the first night. I froze, my mind racing, but then I realized something. The tracks weren't heading toward me. They were moving away back into the forest and growing smaller with distance. Whoever or whatever had been watching, it seemed satisfied for now. That evening, I made a fire in the fireplace. The sound of crackling was oddly comforting. I checked every door and window again. The forest outside seemed quieter, almost normal. I allowed myself to relax, though I didn't lower my guard. For the first time in days, I slept without waking at every sound. On the last day, I packed up early, careful not to leave anything behind that might attract attention. As I drove down the winding gravel road, I glanced at the trees and noticed a pair of dark eyes reflecting in the morning light for just a second before disappearing. I didn't stop to look closer. I kept driving, heart still racing, but a strange calm had settled over me. Whatever had been out there, I had survived. I told myself it had been a hunter, maybe someone living off the grid. The woods were full of people who didn't appear on maps or records. Or maybe it had been an animal, a large one I couldn't identify. Either way, I had learned that fear is often about being unprepared, about isolation, about the unknown. When I finally reached the main highway, the noise of traffic and civilization felt almost unreal. I looked back once at the forested road behind me, the trees dark and still. I knew I would never forget those nights, the silence that wasn't silence, the watching, the deliberate steps in the dark. But I also knew I had faced it and walked away. That cabin had tested me, and I had survived on instinct, caution, and patience. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt wary, alive in a way the city could never offer. Even now, years later, I think about that cabin whenever I'm alone in the woods or when the wind rattles the windows. I remember the smell of damp pine, the cold stone of the fireplace, the taste of fear and relief. And I remember the simple, unshakable truth. Sometimes the scariest encounters don't come from the supernatural. They come from being alone, from the unknown, and from realizing that you're entirely on your own. It was the fall of 1997, and I had decided to take a week off from the city. I was 32 at the time, tired of the constant noise and the way the streets of Cleveland seemed to trap you in a loop of traffic and deadlines. I had rented a small cabin in the Allegheny National Forest, about 3 hours north of the city. The owner, an older man named Harold, had assured me it was quiet, off the grid, and perfect for anyone wanting to get away. That sounded like exactly what I needed. I packed lightly, just a duffel bag with warm clothes, a small supply of canned food, a few bottles of water, and my old camping gear, and set out early in the morning. The road into the forest was narrow, winding, and often nothing more than a path of dirt and gravel. My old Ford pickup rattled with every pothole and loose rock. By the time I reached the last mile, the trees had thickened, the sky was barely visible, and the only sound was the crunch of my tires over the uneven road. I remember the air being sharp and cold, carrying a wet, earthy smell that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The cabin itself was modest, a single story made of dark wood with a steeply pitched roof and a small porch. It had one main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bedroom at the back. The windows were grimy and coated with the dust of seasons, and the door creaked loudly whenever I opened it. Inside, the smell was that of old wood and must, like the cabin hadn't been used regularly for some time. I set my things down, started a fire in the fireplace, and let the warmth spread through my chilled body. The first night was uneventful, other than the natural noises of the forest. The wind rattled the windows, and I could hear branches hitting the roof. Somewhere in the distance, an animal cried out, maybe a coyote. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the fire and a small dinner I had prepared. I went to sleep early, lulled by the isolation. The second day, I went for a hike to explore the area. The forest was thick, and the paths weren't marked well, but I liked that. I could hear the rustle of leaves under my boots and birds squawking high in the trees. Around midday, I spotted a small creek and decided to follow it upstream. The water was cold and clear, and I crouched down to drink a little and splash some on my face. It was then I noticed something unusual. On the bank, partially covered in leaves, was a tattered backpack. It looked old, maybe a week or two old, and there was no one around. My first thought was to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it slowly. Inside were some clothes, a half-empty water bottle, and a small notebook. The notebook had pages filled with hasty writing and sketches of the forest, marked with strange notes about paths, locations, and some numbers I didn't understand. The handwriting was messy, but I could tell the person who had been here was disorganized, maybe even desperate. I decided to take the backpack back to the cabin. Something about finding it felt wrong, like a warning I didn't want to hear but couldn't ignore. When I got back, I set it near the fireplace and sat staring at it. The rest of the evening passed quietly, but my mind kept wandering back to the notebook. The third day was when things started to feel truly wrong. I woke up early and went outside. The sky was overcast, and a light drizzle was falling. The forest seemed denser than before, and the smell of wet soil and decaying leaves was strong. I decided to go further along the road leading from the cabin, just to see how deep into the forest it went. I drove the pickup slowly, the tires squishing in mud, and noticed how unnervingly quiet it had become. There were no birds, no wind in the trees, just an oppressive, heavy silence. That's when I saw it, a figure standing near a bend in the road. At first, I thought it was a hunter, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man, slouched and barely moving. He wore ragged clothes, his face was pale, and he looked exhausted. I stopped the truck about 50 feet away, unsure what to do. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't move, just stood there, staring at the ground. My gut tightened, but something in his posture screamed danger, or at least danger to himself. I tried to get him to notice me, honking the horn lightly, but still he didn't move. The rain was getting heavier, and the ground was slick. I knew leaving him there could be fatal. He looked like he hadn't eaten or slept in days. I carefully got out of the truck and approached him slowly. He flinched but didn't resist. When I got close enough, I could see his face was streaked with dirt and blood from minor cuts, and his eyes were wild. He mumbled something incoherent, not forming words I could understand. I had no choice. I helped him into the truck, wrapped him in a blanket I had, and drove back to the cabin. The entire ride, he remained barely conscious, shivering violently. I laid him down on the living room floor, gave him water, and tried to make him comfortable. It was clear he was starving, dehydrated, and possibly sick. I didn't have cell service, and there was no other cabin nearby. For the first time, I felt true isolation. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind where if something went wrong, you were completely on your own. Over the next 2 days, I took care of him as best I could. I boiled water, gave him canned food, and kept the fire going. His condition improved slowly, but he remained quiet, almost catatonic, only occasionally muttering phrases I couldn't understand. I cleaned his minor wounds and tried to get him to drink enough water. The notebook I had found earlier seemed to belong to him. He had lost it somehow. As I flipped through it again, I realized the numbers were coordinates or markings of food sources, places he had tried to survive while lost in the forest. He had been wandering for almost 2 weeks without contact. By the 5th day, he was able to stand and move slowly. I decided it was time to try to get him back to civilization. The rain had cleared, and the road was less slippery. I drove us to the nearest ranger station, which took about 2 hours over rough roads. When we arrived, they took him immediately and began giving him medical attention. I stayed long enough to ensure he was stable before heading back to the cabin. The drive back was quiet. I kept thinking about how easily he could have died if I hadn't found him or if I had ignored the backpack. The forest felt less menacing now, almost peaceful, like it had simply been waiting for someone to notice the danger before it would let him survive. When I returned to the cabin, I cleaned up, packed my things, and prepared to leave the next morning. I sat on the porch one last time, looking at the dense forest, the wet leaves glistening in the morning light, and realized how fragile life could be in places so isolated. The cabin, once a simple escape, had become the place where a man's life was saved, and I was grateful I had been there. Driving back to the city, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. The forest seemed almost like a living thing in my memory, dangerous but not malevolent, beautiful but unforgiving. That week changed something in me. I realized the difference between life and death could be just a few choices, a few minutes of hesitation. I never returned to that cabin after that trip, but I never forgot it either. I told Harold I wouldn't rent it again, and I never wanted to. Yet, I can still see the way the rain glistened on the leaves, the way the forest smelled of wet earth, and the quiet, desperate eyes of the man I saved. It stays with me, a reminder that sometimes survival is just being in the right place at the right time, and that even in the deepest isolation, you are never truly alone if you are willing to act. It was the late autumn of 1998 when I joined a small group of woodcutters for a week-long retreat in the dense forests of northern Vermont. I was 27 at the time, in decent shape but not exactly an outdoorsman, though I liked the idea of hard, honest work and the quiet that came with being deep in the woods. The group consisted of 4 others besides me. Tom, a grizzled man in his 50s who had spent decades felling trees for a living. Eric, a lanky guy in his early 30s with a sharp eye for timber. Marcus, younger and muscular, full of energy but often reckless. And finally, Jonah, a quiet fellow in his 40s who mostly kept to himself but worked with a precision that made him valuable when it came to cutting and measuring. We had rented a small cabin that sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines and maples. It was an old structure, probably built in the 1930s, with warped wooden floors, a sagging roof, and a stone fireplace that looked like it had been used for decades. The cabin smelled faintly of damp wood, moss, and the lingering musk of the forest, which gave it a kind of rustic authenticity that made the week feel like stepping back in time. The first day was uneventful. We unloaded our chainsaws, axes, and supplies and planned out which areas we would tackle. We were far enough in the forest that our nearest neighbor was at least 3 miles away, and the roads leading up to the cabin were little more than dirt tracks, slick and muddy from the early November rains. The sky had a gray, oppressive heaviness, and when the wind passed through the trees, it carried a low, constant moan. We started cutting in the morning, the rhythm of chainsaws and axes echoing through the forest. By late afternoon, the work left us exhausted, coated in sweat, sawdust, and the dark grime of wet bark. Returning to the cabin, we lit the old wood stove and tried to dry out our clothes and boots by the fire. I remember sitting on the edge of my cot, watching sparks rise into the chimney, thinking about how isolated we were. I liked it. I liked the sense that nothing and no one could reach us here. On the second day, something shifted. Marcus had gone further down a trail than the rest of us, chasing what he claimed were the largest, straightest pines. By midday, he hadn't returned, and the forest seemed unnaturally silent around us. Birds weren't chirping, and the usual rustle of small animals in the undergrowth was gone. Tom and Eric went after him, calling his name. I stayed near the cabin, cutting smaller trees and keeping the fire going. Hours passed. Eventually, Tom came back, mud-slicked and tense, with Eric trailing silently behind him. Marcus was gone. Tom said he'd followed Marcus's tracks and heard a shout, but when they reached him, he had vanished. No sign of a fall, no broken branches to suggest he had tripped, nothing but footprints that just stopped. Jonah and I tried to rationalize it. The forest was vast, dense, and uneven. Maybe Marcus had wandered into a hidden ravine or gotten lost in the thick undergrowth. We spent the next few hours searching with flashlights, but as night fell, we had to return to the cabin, our stomachs twisting with unease. That night, I lay awake on my cot listening to the wind push through the trees. Every crack of a branch or rustle in the darkness made me tense. We had left a fire going in the fireplace, but the shadows in the cabin seemed to stretch longer than they should. When I tried to sleep, I kept imagining glimpses of movement outside the window, something fleeting between the trees, but I couldn't be sure. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, that fear was magnifying every sound. The next morning, we decided we couldn't wait. We formed a search party. Tom, Eric, and Jonah would comb the area, while I stayed behind at the cabin in case Marcus returned. Hours dragged on, and as the afternoon light waned, a low fog rolled in from the hills, blanketing the forest in a dense, white haze that muffled sound and warped distance. Visibility dropped to only a few meters. That's when I started noticing something odd. The fallen trees we had cut the day before, which should have been laying still in the mud, were in slightly different positions. Branches that I had cleared with my axe were bent or snapped in directions I didn't remember. I chalked it up to rain or wind, but a creeping sense of unease settled over me. By evening, the search party returned empty-handed. They looked worn, angry, and scared. Tom admitted quietly that the tracks they were following seemed to vanish into nothingness again, like the earth had swallowed them whole. Eric swore he saw a shadow move between the trees, but when they approached, it was gone. Jonah didn't say anything, just stared at the fire, rubbing the back of his neck. We spent the night huddled near the fire. Sleep was impossible. I kept hearing thumps outside, heavy enough to be footsteps, but no one was there when we checked. We barricaded the cabin doors with furniture, placed axes near our cots, and kept the stove blazing. The wind howled against the cabin walls, rattling the windows and shaking the whole structure, but the noises outside didn't match the wind. They were deliberate, careful, slow. Something or someone was moving just beyond our view. On the third day, Marcus returned, alone. He stumbled into the clearing near the cabin, soaked, covered in scratches and mud, looking delirious. He couldn't explain where he had been, except to mutter that he had been following the trail of trees and shadows, and then something had picked him up and moved him. I could see the genuine terror in his eyes, and while the explanation sounded absurd, the sheer look of fear made all of us uneasy. He was physically unharmed, strangely unharmed for the scratches and mud covering him, but he refused to speak beyond fragmented sentences about walking through the fog and the forest changing. We packed up immediately, deciding to cut our trip short. As we left the forest, each of us carried a heavy silence. The cabin, once comforting in its rustic isolation, now seemed oppressive and alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the trees themselves remembered the way Marcus had disappeared and returned. Even after we reached the road and the distant lights of the nearest town, the tension didn't lift. The forest behind us was just a forest, but in my mind, it had become a labyrinth of moving shadows, impossible angles, and an unnerving intelligence. Years later, I think about that trip often. I still can't explain what happened. There was no supernatural force, no ghostly figure, but the forest had a strange, menacing rhythm that we didn't understand. Marcus never spoke much about what he experienced, and the rest of us tried to pretend it had just been fear and isolation playing tricks on our minds. But the memory of that fog, the moving shadows, and the cabin's heavy silence has stayed with me. I learned something important that week. There are places in the world that are perfectly natural, perfectly ordinary, but still dangerous in ways we can't predict. The forest wasn't evil. It wasn't haunted. It was simply vast, indifferent, and full of hazards that we weren't prepared for, both physical and mental. When I returned to civilization, I carried more than just a few logs or memories of cold nights by the fire. I carried a deep respect for the unknown, for the raw, untamed wilderness, and for the fragile nature of human perception when faced with it. Even now, when I hear the wind whistle through the trees during late autumn storms, I feel a flicker of that same unease. Not fear of monsters, but fear of the immense, quiet, shifting world that exists beyond the edge of the cabin door. The kind that doesn't need magic or ghosts to make a man question everything he thought he knew about reality. I remember the day like it was yesterday, though it was 10 years ago. I was 24, driving my old pickup along a narrow countryside road in the hills outside Ashford, England. The year was 2015, and the weather had been dreary for days. Rain falling in a steady drizzle that left the dirt roads slick and muddy. I had been visiting a few of my father's old friends to pick up some rare tools he had left behind when he passed. That afternoon, I had planned to head back home, but a sense of unease had been nagging me all morning. I couldn't shake it, though I tried to dismiss it as fatigue from the long drive and lack of sleep. The road was barely more than a track, winding between dense hedgerows and fields that stretched out like a patchwork of dull green and brown. The sky was a low, thick gray, and the drizzle made it hard to see more than a few dozen yards ahead. I was alone except for the old radio in my truck, which barely picked up static. As I drove, I noticed something in the distance, a figure lying across the narrow road. At first, I thought it was a large branch or some debris, but as I drew closer, the shape became horrifyingly clear. It was a body, a man, sprawled unnaturally in the middle of the track. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding in the wet mud. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I rolled down the window, the cold drizzle hitting my face, and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The man was dressed in a dark jacket and muddy trousers, his face turned away. At first, I thought he was asleep or had collapsed from exhaustion, but the unnatural angle of his limbs and the pale, gray color of his skin told a different story. He was dead. I froze for a moment, unsure what to do. The countryside was remote, miles from any house, and the nearest village was at least a 20-minute drive away if I hurried. My phone had almost no signal. I knew I needed help, but my mind raced with questions. Who was he? How had he ended up here in the middle of a wet dirt road? I carefully stepped out of the truck, my boots sinking into the mud, and approached the body. There was no sign of a car crash, no blood on the road, just the man, lifeless, lying there as if dropped from the sky. I backed away slowly, my stomach twisting. I needed to get help without touching anything. I drove a little further down the road, hoping for a farmhouse or some sign of life, but the road only twisted further into the hills, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to close in on me. That's when I saw it. A small cabin, half hidden behind a copse of trees, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. It wasn't on any map I had seen, and there were no signs of other people nearby, but I had no choice. I needed to call someone, anyone, and the cabin looked like it had a phone line. I parked my truck on the narrow track, mud splashing up the sides, and made my way to the cabin. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Inside, the air smelled damp and musty, and I could see the remnants of an old fire in the hearth. Dust covered the furniture, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. It looked like no one had lived here in months, maybe years, yet the smoke from the chimney told me someone might still be around. I searched quickly, calling out, but there was no response. Near the corner, I spotted a small table with a rotary phone perched on it. My hands shook as I picked up the receiver, praying for a dial tone. To my relief, there was one. I dialed the local police, explaining as calmly as I could what I had seen on the road. They told me to stay put and that a patrol car was on the way. Hanging up, I sank into a chair, trying to steady my racing heart. I could hear the rain tapping on the roof and the occasional creak of the old cabin settling, each sound making me jump. Time seemed to stretch. Every minute felt like an hour. I kept glancing out the window, expecting to see movement on the road, but there was nothing, just the endless gray drizzle and the shadows of trees. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop, a set of footprints in the mud, leading from the road to the cabin. They were fresh, large, heavy boots, and they stopped just outside the cabin. I realized with a cold chill that I was not alone, that someone had been following me or had been near the body, possibly watching. I crouched behind the table, heart hammering, eyes fixed on the door. I could hear the faint sound of the wind outside, and then the unmistakable crunch of mud under boots. Whoever it was approached slowly, stepping carefully, as if aware of my presence. My mind raced, imagining the worst. Then, a hand pushed the door open just slightly. I held my breath, my fingers clutching the chair. A man's face appeared in the doorway, middle-aged, with dark, tired eyes. He wasn't smiling, wasn't angry, just watching. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and spoke in a low, calm voice, telling me to stay still. I realized he wasn't a threat in the sense I had feared. He looked exhausted, almost relieved to see another person. He explained, briefly and without emotion, that the man on the road had been a stranger who had stumbled onto his property, injured in a fall or accident. The man had died before he could help him. The cabin man had been trying to figure out what to do, afraid of being blamed for something he hadn't caused. Minutes later, the sound of sirens broke the heavy quiet. Police cars and an ambulance arrived, their lights cutting through the gray drizzle. I stepped outside with the man from the cabin, trying to explain everything I had seen. They took statements from both of us, and I could see the officers carefully examining the scene, noting the absence of skid marks or any sign of foul play beyond what appeared to be an accidental death. By the time the investigation ended, night had fallen. I got back into my truck, mud covering my boots and coat, and drove home slowly, the rain still falling. I kept thinking about that man lying on the road, how easily someone could be lost in the countryside, unnoticed and alone, and how quickly fear can take over when reality is unclear. The cabin, the stranger, the dead man. It all stayed with me, a memory of how fragile life is and how thin the line is between safety and disaster. Years later, I still drive that road carefully, even when it's sunny. I think of that day often, the smell of wet earth and old wood, the silence broken only by rain and distant sirens. I've never returned to that cabin, but I know the man is still there, keeping to himself, living quietly in the hills. And every time I pass that stretch of road, I can't help but glance at the trees, wondering if anyone else might be lying there, unnoticed, in the same lonely way. It wasn't a story of monsters or ghosts, just life in its rawest form. Unexpected, terrifying, and ultimately human. The ending, clear and unromanticized, stayed with me. Some accidents happen without reason, and sometimes survival just means keeping your head and finding the help that's out there, even if it takes every nerve you have to get to it. I was 31 in the autumn of 2019 when I decided to take a weekend trip into the northern edges of Manitoba, far from anything I was used to. I had been stressed from work for months, and for some reason I believed that 2 quiet days in the woods would fix something inside me. I had picked a small rented place on the map, not knowing that the road leading to it had been abandoned for years and that the cabin itself hadn't been lived in for even longer. I had booked it online through a poorly made website that looked half broken but still accepted my payment, so I assumed everything was normal. The drive took almost 8 hours from the town I stayed in. The deeper I went into the woods, the more the air felt thin and cold, even though it was supposed to be early autumn. The trees looked older than anything I had seen before, thick trunks covered in layers of dark moss. Most of the road was gravel mixed with mud, and I felt my tires slipping every few minutes. There were no road signs, no houses, no lights, not even broken fences. Nothing but trees pressing on both sides like the forest was swallowing the road. I found the cabin only after my phone lost signal. It looked smaller than I expected, almost like someone had placed a wooden box at the edge of a dead clearing. The roof sagged in the middle. Almost all the windows were covered with dirt from storms long gone. The door looked swollen from rain. The clearing around it was filled with old rusted cans, crushed metal parts, and fallen branches that seemed untouched for years. The cabin felt wrong the moment I stepped out of my car, but I told myself it was only because it looked older than the pictures online. When I pushed the door open, a burst of stale air rushed out. It smelled like wet wood, dust, and something metallic that I couldn't identify. The floor creaked under my weight in a way that made me imagine the whole place collapsing if I moved too fast. Inside was a single room with a small bathroom at the back. A cracked table stood in the center, covered in a layer of dust that looked like it had been building up for a decade. A mattress sat in the corner with ripped fabric exposing the yellow foam inside. There was no electricity, no working stove. The water tap only coughed out brown liquid before giving up completely. I felt stupid for not checking reviews, for trusting a website that looked like it was coded 15 years earlier. But I had already driven so far, and the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. I didn't feel like turning back. I told myself it was only 2 nights and that I would manage somehow. I unpacked a few things, but I kept most of my stuff in the car because something inside the cabin didn't feel right. The air felt heavy, almost like the walls were trapping it. Every time I moved, the floor made a long dragging sound that echoed in a strange way. Still, I sat down and tried to calm myself. I kept telling myself I was being dramatic, that old houses always felt creepy at first. As the evening settled, the temperature dropped faster than I expected. I layered on my jacket and went outside to collect dry sticks around the clearing so I could make a small fire near the cabin. While picking up sticks, I noticed something odd: deep boot tracks around the side of the cabin. They were old, edges softened by rain, but still clear enough to see. The direction of the prints led toward the back of the cabin, then disappeared into the thick brush. I tried to tell myself they were from a past visitor or the owner, but something about them made me uneasy. They were spaced strangely close together, like whoever walked had been moving very slowly or dragging their feet. The size looked similar to mine, but the steps sunk deeper into the soil than what a normal man's weight should create. When it got dark, I decided not to light the fire after all. A bad feeling pressed hard on my chest, and I didn't want to draw attention to myself. The clearing was silent, completely dead, Not even insects buzzing or birds calling. Inside the cabin, the darkness spread like a thick blanket. I used my flashlight, but every time I turned it, shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls simply from the shape of the rotting wooden boards. I tried to sleep early, but the air grew colder and colder. The silence outside wasn't comforting. It felt like something was standing just out of sight, watching the cabin. I lay on the mattress with my flashlight still in my hand, staring at the ceiling and listening to my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I kept going over the deep boot tracks I'd seen. I tried to convince myself they were years old, but something inside me kept whispering that they weren't. Around midnight, I heard something outside, soft, slow scraping against the back wall of the cabin. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was too steady, too deliberate, like someone dragging a piece of wood or metal along the outside boards. My muscles tightened and I stayed completely still. The scraping paused for several seconds, then continued again, slower this time, like whoever or whatever was doing it was waiting for a reaction. I turned my flashlight off and stared into the dark. Without the beam, the cabin felt even smaller, like the darkness was closing in on me. The scraping traveled along the side of the cabin, moving toward the window. It stopped right behind the wall where the mattress sat. I could feel the vibrations through the old wood. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My hands were shaking so hard I had to press them into the mattress to keep them from making noise. Minutes passed, then more. Eventually, the scraping faded. I stayed awake the entire night, too afraid to close my eyes. At the first hint of dawn, I got up and walked outside. The cold air hit me sharply. The ground was damp from a light drizzle that must have passed through overnight. I walked slowly around the cabin, and when I reached the back, I saw long marks carved into the wooden boards, thin, uneven lines about the height of my waist. Some lines were shallow, others deep enough to expose the inner grain. I checked for animal tracks, but there were none. No footprints either. The mud around the cabin looked untouched except for my own prints from the day before. The deep boot tracks I had seen earlier were still there, unchanged. But now they looked different to me. They didn't seem old anymore. They seemed deliberate, almost placed. I packed everything in less than a minute. I didn't eat. I didn't look back. I felt watched the entire time, even though I didn't hear anything. The forest felt wrong, like something had stepped closer during the night. When I started my car, my hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the keys. The engine finally started, and I drove out of the clearing as fast as the muddy road allowed. The trees on both sides looked tighter than before, almost bending inward like they were trying to keep me there. It took hours before I reached a proper paved road again. When I finally got cell service, I opened the website I had used to book the cabin, but it was gone. The page didn't exist anymore. The site showed an error message like the whole listing had never been real. I tried searching the address and found nothing. The place wasn't even marked on any map. It was as if the cabin didn't officially exist. I never reported it. I didn't know what to say anyway. I didn't know what scraped the walls, or whose boot tracks were around the clearing, or why the listing had vanished. I only knew that something or someone had been at that cabin long before I arrived, and I left only because they allowed me to. Even now, years later, the sound of slow scraping still wakes me up sometimes in the middle of the night. I always check the walls. I always listen to the silence. And no matter how much time passes, I still see those deep boot tracks in the mud, spaced too closely, pressed too far into the earth, like the weight behind them wasn't quite human. I know I won't ever go back to a place like that again. And I know that if I had stayed one more night, I might not have left at all. I drove out to that old farm in the late autumn of 2017, when I was 32 and trying to get away from the noise of the city. A friend of mine had told me about a small cabin on a piece of land outside a quiet village in northern Wisconsin, far from the road and surrounded by open fields and dry trees. He said the owner rented it out cheaply because nobody wanted to stay there long. I didn't think much of that at the time. I just wanted a break, a place where I could breathe clean air and hear myself think. The farm sat at the end of a long dirt track that cut through fields of old corn stalks and patches of frozen grass. The cabin itself stood behind a leaning barn that looked like it hadn't been touched since the early 80s. Everything around it felt stuck in an older time. The wooden boards were washed out from years of sun and wind. The metal roof had rust stains that ran down the sides like old tears. Even the fence posts looked tired, leaning at different angles like they were giving up. I carried my bags inside the cabin and noticed right away how cold it was. The air smelled like old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic. The floor creaked under my boots. The windows were small and covered with frost around the edges. I could see the fields through them, endless and pale, with the early evening light settling over them like a thin blanket. There was no real furniture except a small bed, a table, and one chair. The place didn't feel welcoming, but I had expected that. Remote farm cabins usually felt this way. I set my things down and walked around the property before the sun disappeared. I checked the barn first. The door was half open, hanging unevenly from its hinges. Inside it was dark, but enough light leaked through the gaps between the boards for me to see piles of broken equipment, old crates, and rusty tools. It looked like someone once tried to run a decent farm here but gave up a long time ago. Dust coated everything like a thick layer of age. There were footprints in the dirt near the back wall, but they didn't look recent. They looked like they had been pressed long ago and never disturbed. A cold wind moved through the barn, and it pushed me to head back toward the cabin. By the time I stepped outside, the sun was slipping behind the tree line in the distance. The cold sharpened, and everything around me went still. It was the kind of silence that felt too heavy, like the fields themselves were watching. Inside the cabin, I lit the small heater the owner kept in the corner. It didn't warm the place much, but it was better than nothing. I sat at the table, trying to settle in, but something about the place made my skin feel tight. The silence pressed on me in a way I couldn't explain. Even in remote places, you usually hear insects, a distant dog, something. But here there was nothing, just the soft crackle of the heater and the stretching sounds of the old wood settling. The first strange thing happened just after midnight. I had been lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard footsteps outside the cabin. Not fast, not sneaky, just slow, spaced out steps moving along the side wall. They were heavy enough that I felt a faint vibration through the floorboards. I stayed still, listening, thinking maybe it was a deer or some other animal crossing close to the building. But the steps stopped right next to the window. I kept my eyes open, staring at the ceiling. I didn't move. The idea of getting up and looking out the window felt wrong, like my body knew something I didn't. After a long minute, the footsteps moved again, circling around the back of the cabin. Then everything went silent. I barely slept after that. In the morning, the frost on the ground was disturbed. I saw a long trail in the frozen soil behind the cabin, something dragging or being pushed. But there were no clear footprints, just a wide streak running toward the barn. I followed it a little, but the cold wind pushed against me and my nerves tightened the closer I got to the barn's open door. I stopped halfway and turned back. The day passed slowly. I tried reading, walking the property, anything to distract myself. But every time I stepped out, I felt watched. Not from the woods, those were too far and too sparse. The watching feeling came from somewhere closer, somewhere shallow and empty, like the barn or even the fields themselves. That night, the sounds returned. They came later this time, maybe around 2 in the morning. I heard something tapping lightly on the side of the cabin, then dragging along the wall. Not claws, not branches, something solid, scraping the wood in small, uneven pulls. My chest tightened as I lay in the dark, breathing through my nose as quietly as possible. The scraping reached the corner of the cabin, then stopped suddenly. A long, slow breath came from outside, like someone trying to stay quiet while standing in the cold. Then a soft thud, as if something had leaned or pressed against the wall. I didn't sleep at all after that. In the morning, I checked outside again, even though my stomach twisted at the thought. The wood of the cabin had fresh marks, thin scratches near the bottom, too low for a person but too straight for an animal. The trail in the frost behind the cabin was deeper, and this time it continued into the barn. I told myself not to go in, but curiosity and fear mixed into something that pushed me forward. Inside the barn, everything was still and silent, but the air felt heavier, colder than outside. The drag marks went straight to the far corner where the footprints had been the first day. The dirt there looked disturbed, like something had been moved or dug. The boards nearby were loose, and the smell in the air had changed. Still like dust, but sharper, more bitter. I left quickly, shutting the door even though I knew it wouldn't keep anything out if it really wanted to get in. By the third night, my nerves were shot. I sat on the chair with my back to the wall, the heater beside me, and tried to keep myself awake. My hands shook a little. I felt trapped between the cold cabin walls and the open darkness outside. I didn't want to stay another night, but driving out in the dark didn't feel safe either. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something heavier than the nights before. Not scraping, not tapping, something dragging slowly toward the cabin. The sound came from the barn direction. The soil outside was frozen, so the dragging was sharp and rough. My heart beat so hard it felt like it shook the inside of my ribs. The dragging stopped right outside the front door. I stared at the doorknob, watching for any sign of movement. The cold air pushed through the cracks in the frame. I could hear slow breaths, steady and controlled, like someone trying not to make noise. The breath stayed there for a long time. When the sun finally came up, the dragging trail was inches from the door. Something had been there, in the dark, so close that if the door hadn't been locked, it could have come inside. I didn't pack my things. I just grabbed what was closest and left the rest. The shock of the cold outside didn't matter. I got in my truck and drove away down that long dirt path without looking back at the cabin or the barn or the fields. My hands were stiff on the wheel. Every time the truck bounced on the frozen ground, my muscles tightened like I expected something to grab the back. When I reached the main road, I finally exhaled. My chest hurt like I'd been holding my breath the entire night. I never returned to the cabin, and I never asked my friend anything about it. I didn't want to know what had happened on that land years before, or why nobody stayed long, or what was moving around the barn at night. I only knew one thing with complete clarity. Whatever was out there was real, and it didn't want me on that farm. And leaving when I did was the only reason I'm still here to tell the story. I was 28 when I decided to take a solo hunting trip deep in the mountains of northern Montana. I had spent years hunting with my father and uncle when I was younger, but this trip was meant to be different. Completely alone, off the grid, in a part of the forest I had barely even scouted. The year was 2016, late October, when the days were short and the nights already carried that bone-deep chill that made the skin crawl. I had rented a small, old hunting cabin a few miles off the nearest dirt road. The cabin looked uninviting at first glance. Its wood was gray and weathered, shingles missing in patches, and a thin plume of smoke lazily curling from the crooked chimney. I arrived in the late afternoon. My truck crunched over the gravel road as I approached the cabin, the forest around me already thick with shadows. Pine trees leaned together over the trail like they were whispering secrets to each other, their needles rattling softly in the cold wind. I parked the truck, loaded my backpack with hunting gear, and took a long look at the cabin. It was small, maybe 20 by 20, with a loft above for sleeping. A rusty metal stove sat in the corner, and a pile of split firewood was stacked beside the door. The scent of damp pine and old smoke filled the air. I spent the first hour unloading my supplies, stacking firewood carefully, and setting up my small camping stove inside. There was no electricity, of course, and the only light came from the windows, which were grimy with years of dust and soot. I lit a fire in the stove, feeling a wave of warmth spread through my chest, and unpacked the rest of my gear. My rifle, binoculars, a few cans of food, and a thermos of coffee. Outside, the sun was already bleeding away behind the peaks, turning the sky a dull orange. Shadows lengthened unnaturally fast, stretching over the forest floor like something waiting to reach for me. That night, I went to bed early. I had planned a long hunt in the morning, and the thin mattress in the loft promised at least a few hours of rest. The wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls, rattling the window frames, and I could hear the forest around me. Deer moving in the underbrush, the occasional snap of a branch, maybe a coyote howling somewhere in the distance. I fell asleep listening to it all, thinking how peaceful and remote it felt. But the next morning was different. I woke before dawn, the sky a deep shade of indigo, the stars sharp and cold overhead. I brewed some coffee on the small stove and dressed in layers, ready for the hunt. I stepped outside, and the frost on the ground crunched under my boots. My plan was simple: move slowly through a ridge where deer were known to travel and wait. The forest was quiet but heavy with a sense of being watched, like the trees themselves were observing me, though I knew it was only my imagination. Hours passed without much movement. I sat in a small clearing, scanning with my binoculars, but the forest was nearly empty. By noon, I had spotted a few deer, but none in a position to take a clean shot. I decided to head back to the cabin, moving carefully, my boots silent against the pine needles. That's when I noticed something odd. The tracks in the mud weren't mine. They were fresh, large human footprints, muddied and uneven, leading straight toward the cabin. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. There was no one else supposed to be in this part of the forest, not for miles. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a hiker or another hunter, but the tracks were too erratic, too deep, as if whoever made them had been moving quickly and then stopped, watching something. I tightened my grip on my rifle, the metal cold against my palms, and slowly moved toward the cabin. Every step felt deliberate, each sound amplified. The crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, even my own breathing seemed deafening. When I reached the cabin, my stomach sank. The door, which I was sure I had locked that morning, was now slightly ajar. I nudged it with my foot, and the hinges creaked in protest. Inside, the air smelled different, metallic, sharp, like blood. My eyes scanned the room. Nothing seemed out of place at first. My stove, my firewood, my supplies. But then I noticed the small things. A boot print on the dusty floor near the stove, smudges on the counter. A piece of paper from my pack moved to the center of the table. My pulse raced. I didn't want to believe someone had been inside while I was hunting. It made no sense. But the footprints outside were proof. I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside again, circling the cabin carefully. That's when I saw movement in the tree lean, maybe 50 yards away. A dark shape, crouched low. I couldn't make out who or what it was. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I stayed still, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't come closer, just watched. I decided then I had to leave. Staying in the cabin was no longer an option. I loaded my gear back into the truck, trying not to make a sound, and kept my eyes on the tree lean the entire time. As soon as I started the engine, the figure vanished, like it had melted into the shadows. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely grip the steering wheel. I drove slowly back toward the main road, the forest around me alive with unseen eyes. Every snap of a branch made me jerk, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting the figure to be following me. By the time I reached the paved highway, the sun was dipping low, washing the landscape in orange and red. I pulled over at a gas station, heart still pounding, and tried to calm myself. I called the local ranger station and reported the intrusion, explaining about the footprints and the figure in the treeline. They assured me they would check the area, though they warned it was remote and such incidents were rare. The next day, I went back with a couple of rangers. The cabin was empty, no signs of anyone still there, but the door had been forced open and the inside ransacked slightly. The footprints in the mud were gone, vanished as if whoever it was had melted back into the forest. The rangers told me it could have been a poacher or someone living off the grid illegally. They found no evidence of weapons or traps, but the thought of someone watching the cabin, waiting, unsettled me deeply. I never went back to that part of Montana again. The cabin stayed abandoned for years, and every time I think about it, I remember the cold wind through the trees, the dark shape crouched in the shadows, and the suffocating sense of being completely alone with someone who shouldn't have been there. I learned something important that trip. No matter how prepared you think you are, the forest can hide more than just animals, and not every fear is imagined. Some of them are very real. It took me months to shake the memory completely, the way the silence pressed on me like a living thing. But eventually, I could tell the story without my hands shaking, without my pulse racing. And while the fear never fully disappeared, I felt something else too. A cautious respect for the wilderness and the people who might be hiding within it. I carry my rifle differently now, more alert, more aware of every sound and shadow. The cabin is gone now, torn down by the property owner years later, but the memory of those footprints, the smell in the air, and the dark shape in the trees stays with me. It reminds me that reality can be scarier than any story, and survival sometimes just means noticing the warning signs in time and trusting your instincts. I never expected a summer in the Pacific Northwest to be anything other than routine, but that was before 1998, before I learned that the forest has a way of making you question everything you think you know. My name is David Harper, and I was 28 at the time, working as a park ranger in the Cascadia National Forest, a sprawling wilderness area in northern Washington. I'd been on the job for 5 years, and I'd spent hundreds of nights patrolling trails, checking on campsites, and keeping the occasional camper from wandering too far into the thick woods. Usually, life out there was quiet, predictable, and occasionally monotonous. But this particular stretch of the summer would leave a mark I'll never forget. I was assigned to a remote section of the park called Deep Pine Ridge, a region known for its dense cedar groves, steep ridges, and narrow valleys that made radio communication spotty at best. The cabin I was stationed at, Cabin 7, was a small, weathered structure built decades ago for rangers who needed a place to stay overnight. It had a tin roof that banged against itself when the wind picked up, a fireplace that had seen better days, and a single, narrow window that looked out over the ridge. The cabin was isolated, no road access beyond a rough dirt trail, only accessible by a 4-mile hike through thick brush. I arrived at Cabin 7 mid-afternoon after a long hike with a pack full of supplies. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. Rain had been falling in drifts all day, soaking the forest floor and making the trail slick with mud. My boots slipped more than once as I made my way to the cabin, and the sound of distant water rushing through the valley below was constant and hypnotic. I set my pack down, hung up my raincoat, and started a fire in the fireplace, the smoke curling up through the rusty stovepipe. The first night was uneventful. I patrolled the nearby trails, checked the boundary markers, and documented everything in my logbook. By the time the sky darkened to a deep indigo, I was exhausted. The forest was alive with the sound of rain hitting the roof and the occasional call of an owl echoing through the trees. I fell asleep to the rhythm of the storm, not knowing that this night would mark the beginning of something I couldn't have anticipated. Around 2 in the morning, I was awakened by a sudden, sharp sound, a branch snapping outside. My heart jumped, and I lay still for a moment, listening. Rain pummeled the roof, masking other noises, but there it was again. A crunch of leaves, deliberate and slow, coming from the ridge above the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously peered out the window. The beam cut through the sheets of rain, illuminating nothing but twisted trunks and undergrowth. I told myself it was a deer, or maybe a wandering bear. Cabin 7 was in the middle of bear country, and they were not uncommon. Still, there was something about the movement I couldn't place. It didn't feel natural. The next morning, I left the cabin to check the nearby trail markers. Rain had turned into a persistent drizzle, making the forest smell damp and alive. The trail was slick, and the mud clung to my boots. About 2 miles out, I noticed a set of footprints in the soft mud. They weren't mine, and they weren't animal tracks. Human, large, heavy, unevenly spaced. They led up the hill toward the ridge, disappearing into a thick patch of undergrowth. I followed them cautiously, my hand resting on the grip of my service knife. They stopped abruptly at the edge of a small clearing. The grass was flattened as if someone had been lying there. My stomach tightened. Whoever had been here had left no other trace. No discarded supplies, no broken branches, but the presence was unmistakable. I returned to the cabin and radioed the park headquarters, but the signal was patchy. All I could manage was a brief report. Possible unauthorized person on Deep Pine Ridge. Tracks found. Will monitor. The response was brief and cautious. Copy that. Stay alert. Keep radio check-ins every 2 hours. I nodded, even though no one could see me. That night, the unease returned. The wind howled through the ridge, bending the trees almost horizontally. Rain pelted the tin roof like a drum, and I stayed awake by the fire, cleaning my knife and checking the locks on the cabin door. Around midnight, I heard it again. Soft, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I froze, straining to hear through the storm. The steps stopped, then shifted to the opposite side of the cabin. My mind raced. If someone had followed the trail, they might have circled the ridge to reach me without being seen. The following day, the storm cleared, leaving the forest wet but eerily calm. I hiked down the trail toward the ranger outpost, hoping to get a clearer signal and a report. On the way, I found something that made my blood run cold. Another set of footprints, this time leading away from the trail into a section of dense cedar trees. And there, partially hidden under some brush, was a torn jacket, military green, soaked through, with no sign of the owner nearby. My heart pounded. This was no casual hiker. I reported the finding immediately, and park headquarters dispatched a search team. They arrived by late afternoon, a group of 3 rangers and a tracker with a trained dog. We followed the trail for hours. The footprints led deeper into the forest, across a small stream, and finally to a clearing where an abandoned fire pit sat cold and covered with ash. There were no signs of the person, no struggle, nothing but the small remnants of a fire and flattened grass where someone had clearly spent the night. We spent 2 more days combing the area, calling out, shining flashlights, and checking the ridges. By the end of the 3rd day, we had to accept that the man had vanished into the forest. No one ever figured out who he was or why he had been there. The only clue was the jacket, which was eventually returned to the station for analysis. Even then, it yielded no information. I returned to cabin 7 one last time before the end of my shift. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, just as it had when I arrived. The wind rustled through the trees, but the forest seemed emptier, almost hollow. I sat on the porch, looking out over the ridge where the footprints had disappeared. I thought about the man who had come into the forest and simply vanished, swallowed by the trees. The experience left a lingering unease, a sense that the forest itself was watching, indifferent and endless. By the time I hiked out of Deep Pine Ridge, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the damp trail. I never saw the man again, and the story of Cabin 7 became one of those unsolved mysteries whispered among the rangers, a reminder that sometimes people disappear for reasons the world can't explain, and sometimes the wilderness keeps its secrets, hidden in the quiet rustle of the trees and the endless reach of the ridges. I left the park later that year, but every time I smell wet pine after a rain, I remember the footprints, the torn jacket, and the quiet, unsettling thought that someone had walked these forests and then simply disappeared without a trace. It was the fall of 1987, and my wife, Karen, and I decided to escape the relentless heat of Phoenix by taking a trip to northern Arizona. The plan was simple: rent a small, old cabin deep in the forest near the Mogollon Rim, far away from towns, roads, and phones. We both worked too much and needed silence, needed space where the air smelled like pine and damp earth instead of dust and exhaust. The cabin was something I'd found in a tattered real estate pamphlet, a two-room wooden shack built sometime in the 1940s. The owner assured me it had been recently renovated, which, in hindsight, meant little beyond a new coat of peeling paint on the outside and a fresh padlock on the door. We arrived just before dusk. The winding dirt road leading up the hill was lined with skeletal oaks and massive ponderosa pines. The car jostled over rocks and ruts, and every time we hit a bump, I swore I could hear the cabin itself creak, as if it were waking to our approach. When we finally stopped, the sun was low, casting long orange streaks through the forest, and the cabin appeared like some relic lost in time. Its windows were grimy, the roof sagged slightly on one side, and the porch steps had warped so badly I almost tripped climbing them. Karen looked at it and smiled nervously, gripping my hand. "It's old," she said, trying to make it sound reassuring. I nodded and pushed the door open, the hinges shrieking in protest. Inside smelled of old wood, dust, and mildew, a combination that made me wrinkle my nose. The floorboards groaned under our weight, and the air was so cold it made me shiver, even though it had been warm outside. The cabin had a small living area with a wood-burning stove, a narrow kitchen with a rust-stained sink, and one bedroom with a lumpy mattress. There were cobwebs in the corners and tiny scuttling noises from the walls, which we both ignored, assuming it was mice or small forest creatures. We spent the first evening unpacking what little we brought and lighting the stove. Karen insisted I stack firewood carefully, and I took my time, hearing each board snap slightly as I arranged them. By the time the fire caught, the room glowed with a warm orange light, and the shadows of the ceiling beams danced across the walls. Outside, the forest had grown dark, and the wind began to pick up, rattling the cabin's thin windows. The first night was restless. Every creak of the cabin sounded like someone moving upstairs. Every gust of wind against the trees sounded like a low, grinding moan. Karen slept fitfully beside me, and I kept my eyes open, straining to catch any sound that might signal a real threat. I eventually convinced myself it was just the wind, the settling wood, small animals outside. The following day, we explored the surrounding forest. The trees towered above us, their trunks wide and rough, the undergrowth thick and tangled. We found a small stream nearby and tried skipping stones, the water cold and fast. At one point, we noticed footprints in the damp earth, large, deep prints with a tread that didn't match any animal I knew. They were too wide for deer, too long for a dog. They disappeared into the trees, but there were so many of them, spaced irregularly, almost like someone had wandered through the forest in no particular direction. I told myself it was hunters or perhaps a lost hiker, and tried not to think too much about it. Karen laughed nervously when I pointed them out, saying I was overreacting. I hoped she was right. That evening, the wind came up stronger, howling through the trees and shaking the cabin. I went outside to check the firewood pile and nearly jumped out of my skin when a branch snapped close behind me. I spun around, seeing only shadows and the outlines of trees. My heart was pounding as I hurried back inside, slamming the door and double-checking the lock. Karen was sitting by the stove, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and I felt slightly ashamed of my panic. Still, the uneasy feeling didn't leave me. Something about the forest, the isolation, and the creaking cabin was gnawing at the edges of my mind. Night fell again. This time, the noises were worse. Every floorboard groaned. Every wind gust rattled the walls. Around midnight, I thought I heard someone, or something, scraping outside the back window. I froze, listening. Karen stirred in her sleep, murmuring something, unaware of what I was hearing. I got up quietly, grabbed the flashlight, and crept to the back of the cabin. The beam illuminated nothing but the trees, swaying in the wind. But there was mud on the porch, fresh and damp, as if someone had stepped there very recently. The prints didn't match ours. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come. Hours later, I heard it again, scraping, soft footfalls around the cabin. They circled, paused, retreated, and returned, never staying long enough for me to get a good look. I got out of bed, grabbed the hunting knife we brought for protection, and slowly moved to the front door. The lock was intact, the door closed, but on the steps, more prints had appeared overnight. They were big, like the day before, and some were smeared, as if the person or animal that made them had slipped slightly. Morning brought relief, at least for the light, but also a grim realization. We were alone in a forest so remote that even calling for help would take hours. I spent the day reinforcing the windows, stacking heavier furniture against the doors, and making the fire stove ready in case we had to stay inside for a long time. Karen helped quietly, her usual cheer subdued, and I could see the tension in her jaw, the way she kept glancing at the trees. That night, it became clear that the presence outside the cabin wasn't random. The footfalls, the scraping, the rustling, someone was circling us. I didn't sleep at all. I stayed by the window with the flashlight, scanning the trees, watching shadows twist and move. At one point, I saw a figure. A man, tall and thin, crouched between the pines, barely visible. He was looking at the cabin, and I swear I caught the glint of a knife in his hand. My heart hammered. I grabbed Karen, whispered urgently that we had to leave, and we packed whatever we could carry. By first light, we abandoned the cabin. I started the car and drove slowly down the dirt road, eyes constantly scanning the edges of the forest. The prints we had seen circled the cabin like a warning, but now there were more, running parallel to the car, cutting across the road, disappearing back into the trees. I didn't stop, even though the car rattled over rocks and the engine groaned. We didn't look back until we were on the main highway, surrounded by signs of civilization, with other cars passing by. We reported what we saw to the local sheriff, who came with a deputy and checked the cabin. They found signs of someone living rough nearby. Makeshift shelters, burned out campfires, old food cans, but no one was there. The prints matched nothing on record, and the sheriff warned us about staying too long in the backcountry without constant vigilance. Looking back, I realized how lucky we were. That cabin, those woods, and the man, or whatever he was, could have ended our lives easily. We never returned, and we never looked for another secluded cabin. Sometimes I still dream about that night. The shadows moving through the pines, the scraping on the wood, the fresh prints that appeared while we slept. And every time, I feel that same raw fear I felt when I realized the wilderness isn't just beautiful and quiet. It can be relentless, patient, and terrifyingly human. Years later, when telling the story, I still remember the smell of the old cabin, the cold air creeping through the cracks, the way the wind carried 1,000 soft noises. And I remember the hardest truth. The scariest things in the world aren't ghosts or myths. They are people, and the wilderness that hides them until it's too late. It was the fall of 1998, and I was 32, craving a week away from the endless hum of city life in Chicago. My wife, Jenna, and I had found a small, rustic cabin for rent in northern Minnesota, near the edge of the Boundary Waters. The map showed it sitting off a narrow, dirt road surrounded by thick forest, miles from the nearest town. I wanted isolation. I needed the quiet. But nothing in my research or in my own imagination had prepared me for the intensity of that silence once we were there. The cabin itself was a weathered, one-story log structure with a stone chimney and a small porch. The windows were dusty. The door creaked ominously as I opened it, and the inside smelled faintly of mildew mixed with old wood. A small stack of firewood sat next to the fireplace, and the kitchen had the bare essentials: a fridge, a sink, a small propane stove. I dropped our bags and stepped onto the porch, breathing in the crisp air. The forest pressed right up to the cabin, the trees thick and dark, their trunks bending toward each other like they were conspiring. Our first night was mostly peaceful. The wind shook the cabin slightly, and I could hear the distant call of a loon over the lake, but it was a comforting kind of sound. Jenna and I cooked a simple dinner, then curled up in front of the fire with some beers. Around 11 p.m., I finally went to bed, but sleep came slowly. Every creak of the old cabin made me tense, and somewhere in the distance, I heard a sharp snap. I assumed it was a deer or a raccoon. The second day, I decided to explore. There was a small trail leading from the cabin into the forest. I left early, wanting to see the lake at sunrise. The trail was narrow and overgrown in places, and the sun barely penetrated the canopy. As I walked, I noticed how quiet it was. Not just the absence of human noise, but the absence of the usual forest sounds I expected. Birds were few, insects hardly made a sound. There was a subtle but heavy stillness that pressed on my chest. When I returned around mid-morning, Jenna was on the porch, her notebook in hand. I told her about the trail, the lake, the silence. She looked worried but said nothing. We spent the afternoon chopping some of the older firewood, trying to keep busy, and the hours passed slowly. But as night fell, I started noticing something else. Footprints. At first, I thought it was a trick of the mud. There were prints outside the back window, partial, and they weren't deer or bear prints. They were human. I froze, staring at them. They were big, heavy prints, and they led off into the trees. I checked the rest of the cabin, even peering behind it, but there was nothing. Jenna didn't see them at first, and I didn't mention them. Maybe it was a hiker from earlier that day. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The sound of something dragging across the porch woke me at 2 a.m. My stomach dropped. I grabbed the baseball bat we had brought for bear safety and crept to the living room. The porch light outside flickered weakly, and I could just make out shadows moving. Two shapes crouched low, shifting. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. But then I realized something worse. They weren't moving like animals. They were deliberate, careful, like they knew the cabin was empty, or thought it was. I didn't sleep much that night. Every snapping branch, every rustle outside the window made my heart hammer. By morning, I resolved to leave, but Jenna reminded me we had rented it for a week, and that driving out now would be dangerous in the forest. The nearest town was at least an hour away, and the road was narrow and unpaved. I agreed reluctantly and tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were campers, maybe they were lost. Still, the sense of being watched stayed with me. The next day, I tried to keep busy. I chopped more firewood and ventured deeper into the forest, this time with a small knife in my belt and my backpack stocked with supplies. About 2 miles from the cabin, I stumbled upon something that made me freeze entirely. A campsite, clearly abandoned in a hurry. A small fire pit with charred wood, a tattered tent, and a backpack left open, contents scattered. And then, my stomach turned cold. On a tree near the fire pit, someone had scratched words into the bark, "Stay out." I ran back to the cabin, panic growing with every step. When I arrived, I found more prints around the cabin. This time, they were closer, more recent. Someone had been walking along the perimeter. I checked the locks and barricaded the doors as best as I could. Jenna stayed in the kitchen, trying to keep calm, while I walked the perimeter with my bat. The forest seemed alive, every sound amplified in my mind, every shadow moving with sinister intent. That night, the intruders came closer. Heavy thumps on the porch, scratches along the siding. I stayed awake, listening, gripping the bat, every nerve on fire. At one point, I thought I saw movement through the small window above the sink. They were watching, waiting. Dawn couldn't come soon enough. By mid-morning, I knew we couldn't stay. I packed what we could carry, grabbed the car keys, and started the engine. The road out was narrow, winding through dense forest. Every bend made me jump. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following. About 15 minutes in, I saw a figure on the side of the road, partially hidden by a tree. A man, mid-30s, dressed in dark clothes, crouching. He didn't move as I passed. I forced myself to keep driving, heart racing, every muscle tense. Eventually, we reached the town. I reported the situation to the local sheriff, who listened quietly, took notes, and then told me that sometimes people in the area lived off-grid, and trespassing was common. But he also admitted that there had been reports of people targeting cabins like ours, especially isolated ones, sometimes with violence. He said we were lucky to have gotten out when we did. After that, it took months for me to stop replaying the experience. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the footprints, the figures in the shadows, the words carved into the tree. But ultimately, leaving the cabin intact and returning safely became the relief that I clung to. I learned the hard way that isolation can be dangerous in ways you can't always predict. People you can't see and the ones you can't anticipate are often the real threat. Not the wind, not the dark, not the animals. Years later, Jenna and I still talk about that trip, but with a mix of fear and relief. We were naive, maybe, thinking the forest would only be beautiful, only peaceful. But we survived because we stayed alert, because we didn't let curiosity turn into recklessness. That cabin stands empty today, I hear, avoided by locals. And I don't blame them. I think about that week often, the weight of the forest pressing in on me, the eyes in the shadows. It's a memory that doesn't fade, and I know it never will. It was November 1998 when I decided to take a few days off from the city and drive up to a remote cabin in northern Vermont. I was 28 at the time, tired of the constant noise, traffic, and work deadlines that had been gnawing at me for months. The cabin belonged to an old acquaintance of my uncle, a man I had only met once, who had left it to sit empty most of the year. He had warned me over the phone, in a gruff voice that suggested I shouldn't expect comfort, that the cabin was old, isolated, and surrounded by dense woods. But I liked the idea of being alone, with no one around but myself, and a little solitude sounded better than any spa or resort. I left Boston late in the afternoon, and by the time I reached the outskirts of the Green Mountains, the sky had already begun to darken. Rain fell in thick sheets, so hard at times that the wipers on my old Subaru struggled to keep up. The roads were slick and narrow, winding through tall pines that pressed close to the asphalt, and I had to drive carefully to avoid sliding into the ditches on either side. Every mile deeper into the forest, the further the traffic faded away, and the rain started to feel heavier, almost as if it had its own weight. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. It sat at the end of a narrow gravel path, half hidden by overgrown shrubs and the thick shadows of the surrounding trees. The roof sagged slightly, and the paint was faded and peeling, streaked from years of storms. Water dripped steadily from the eaves, forming small puddles that reflected the faint glow of the fading sky. I parked my car, grabbed my bag, and trudged up the wet path to the front door. The cabin smelled like damp wood and mildew. I pushed the door open, and it creaked loudly, echoing through the empty space. Inside, the floorboards were warped and uneven, and the furniture, though functional, looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. A thick layer of dust covered the shelves, and I noticed the faint smell of smoke from an old, unused fireplace. I dropped my bag and tried to shake off the chill that had settled into my bones. I spent the first hour checking the cabin's essentials, making sure the fireplace could actually hold a fire, gathering some old blankets I found in a trunk, and locating the small generator tucked in the corner. The lights worked, though they flickered when I switched on a few lamps. Rain hammered the roof and walls relentlessly, making the room feel smaller and tighter. I lit a fire in the fireplace, the crackling sound and warmth a small comfort against the storm raging outside. Around 9 o'clock, I decided to prepare something to eat. The small kitchen had a rusted stove, a few pots and pans, and an assortment of mismatched utensils. I boiled some water for soup, careful not to spill on the wet, uneven floor. As the wind howled outside, I noticed how the sound seemed louder in the cabin, bouncing off the walls and windows. The rain pounded against the panes in an irregular rhythm, punctuated by the occasional rafter groaning under the weight of water. After eating, I settled into a chair near the fireplace. The room was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the walls and floor. I could hear every tiny creak and pop in the cabin. Floorboards shifting, wood contracting, even the sound of water seeping from the roof in places I hadn't noticed earlier. The isolation started to feel oppressive. I had expected solitude to be calming, but here it felt heavier, almost suffocating. Around midnight, the storm intensified. Rain slapped the windows harder, and the wind bent the trees until they groaned and cracked. I was reading a book, trying to distract myself, when I noticed a sharp, distinct sound outside. Not the rain, not the wind, something heavier, deliberate, moving across the wet ground. At first, I convinced myself it was just a branch falling or an animal trudging through the mud. But then I heard it again. Something was coming closer. I froze, listening. The sound of wet footsteps crunching on the gravel of the path was unmistakable now, slow but deliberate. Whoever or whatever it wasn't hurrying. I remembered the only door to the cabin, the one I had used to come in, and the old, shaky lock on it. The thought of having to secure it made my stomach tighten. I stood and moved toward it, careful not to make a sound that would reveal my presence inside. The footsteps stopped suddenly, as if whoever it was had noticed I was awake. My pulse quickened. I could hear the rain pounding around the cabin, masking other noises, but the sudden stillness outside was unnerving. I crouched low, my hands shaking slightly, eyes fixed on the window. After what felt like an eternity, I realized the person or animal was moving again, circling the cabin. I caught glimpses of a dark shape through the rain-soaked windows, but the storm distorted it, making it hard to see clearly. I didn't know whether to call the police. I had a cell phone, but the signal was non-existent. No one in the nearby towns would answer, even if I could reach them. Panic bubbled in my chest, but I forced myself to think. I needed to make a plan. I retrieved a heavy fireplace poker, keeping low, and slowly moved toward the back of the cabin. The sound outside grew fainter, and I realized the figure was moving away, along the opposite side of the house. Hours passed like this. Every time I thought the noise had stopped, a new sound would emerge. A branch snapping, a splash in a puddle near the cabin, the faintest scrape against the siding. I stayed awake, moving silently, keeping the fire burning, listening. By the early morning, the rain started to ease, and with it came a sense of cautious relief. I decided to step outside once it was light enough. The scene outside was chaotic. Muddy footprints surrounded the cabin, circling it twice before disappearing into the woods. Some were human-sized, others too small to be certain, but they were clear, heavy, deliberate. The storm had left the forest damp and dripping, with broken branches scattered across the ground. I followed the footprints carefully, keeping to the edge of the woods until they faded completely. Whoever or whatever had been there was gone. I spent the next day assessing the situation. I inspected every window and door, reinforced the locks as best as I could with what I found in the cabin, and gathered more wood for the fireplace. I checked the generator, making sure I had a way to signal for help if necessary. By the evening, I realized the storm had passed, leaving a strange stillness in the air, the kind that makes every sound sharper and more noticeable. When I left the cabin a few days later, I felt a mix of relief and unease. The experience had been terrifying in a quiet, persistent way, not because of something supernatural, but because the isolation and unpredictability of the storm and human presence had forced me to confront my own vulnerability. I never found out who had been circling the cabin that night, and in truth, I didn't want to. But I had survived, prepared, and left with a clear understanding of the risks of solitude in the wilderness. The memory of that night stayed with me for years. The sound of rain on the roof, the shadows stretching across the walls, and the unmistakable weight of footsteps just beyond the door. Even now, whenever I hear rain pounding on a roof, I remember that night. It was a reminder that danger doesn't need ghosts or myths to be real. It can be as simple as a storm, a dark forest, and someone or something moving silently in the shadows. And for me, that night in Vermont proved that awareness, caution, and staying calm can be enough to get through even the most unnerving moments. I never thought a weekend in the Scottish Highlands could turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. It was the summer of 2018, and I had rented a small, isolated cabin near Loch Katrine. I was 32 at the time, craving nothing more than a break from my routine in Glasgow. The cabin was advertised as secluded, perfect for peace and nature. And the photos made it look charming: wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and a tiny porch overlooking a small, foggy clearing. I had imagined myself sipping tea in the morning, listening to the wind rustle through the trees, and reading a book by the fire. That was supposed to be my weekend. The first day was quiet and peaceful, just as I expected. I unpacked, set up a small fire, and watched the sun sink behind the hills. By nightfall, the sky had darkened to a deep navy, and the forest surrounding the cabin was nearly silent. Only the occasional owl hoot or the rustling of leaves reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone. I went to bed feeling comfortable and safe, or at least I thought I did. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a faint sound outside. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was probably an animal or the wind brushing against the cabin. But the sound didn't stop. It was a soft, shuffling noise, slow and deliberate, like someone walking on dry leaves. My heart started pounding. I lay in bed, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but the sound got closer, moving around the side of the cabin. I grabbed the small flashlight I kept on the nightstand and tiptoed to the window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing at first. Then, at the edge of the clearing, I saw her. A woman, standing perfectly still, staring directly at the cabin. She looked thin, almost malnourished, with stringy dark hair hanging in uneven lengths around her face. Her dress was tattered, dirt-stained, and hung loosely from her shoulders. I couldn't see her eyes clearly, but her presence made the hair on my neck stand on end. For a long minute, I froze, unsure if I should move or call the police. Then, the woman slowly lifted her hand and waved, just once, but it wasn't friendly. It was deliberate, like she wanted me to see her, to acknowledge her. My mind raced. Who was she? Why was she there in the middle of the night? I didn't feel safe opening the door to confront her. I backed away from the window and tried to listen, but she didn't move again. Sleep was impossible after that. I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, checking the windows every few minutes. Around 4 a.m., I heard it again, the soft shuffling, this time closer, circling the cabin. My stomach tightened. I knew she was out there, moving quietly, waiting for something. By morning, the woman was gone, or at least I couldn't see her in the foggy clearing outside. I tried to shake off the fear, convincing myself she might have just been a lost traveler or someone living rough in the forest. The police in Glasgow had warned me that some parts of the Highlands could attract people who preferred solitude, or worse, but I didn't expect to encounter anything like this. I spent the day cautiously exploring the nearby area. The forest was dense, the trails muddy from the recent rain. As I walked, I couldn't stop glancing behind me, expecting to see her emerging from the trees. But there was nothing. I tried to focus on the beauty around me. The way the sunlight pierced the canopy, the distant sound of water trickling over rocks, but the fear clung to me like a shadow. That evening, I returned to the cabin, feeling uneasy but determined to maintain my weekend. I lit the fireplace and made a simple dinner, trying to ignore the thought of her lurking outside. The night was still, almost unnervingly so. Around 11 p.m., I heard it again, the faint shuffling outside. My pulse spiked. I grabbed my phone and flashlight, ready to call for help, but remembered that the cabin had patchy signal. The line to the police might not even work. I crept to the front door and peeked through the window. The clearing was empty. I exhaled slowly, thinking maybe I had imagined it. Then I saw movement at the edge of the forest, near the path leading up to the cabin. She was standing there again, half hidden behind a tree, staring directly at me. Her posture was different this time. She wasn't waving or moving slowly. She was tense, crouched slightly, as if preparing to move. Fear turned to panic. I remembered the emergency box the cabin owner had mentioned in the welcome notes. A small kit with a whistle, flashlight, and a flare gun. I grabbed it, keeping my hand on the flare, and moved quietly to the back door. I opened it slowly and slipped out, staying behind the cabin's wall to avoid being seen. My plan was to run to the nearest road, which the owner had said was about a 15-minute walk, and flag down a car. The woman didn't follow immediately. She stayed at the edge of the clearing, watching me as I moved. My steps were careful but fast. Halfway to the road, I heard her shuffling again, much closer now, coming from behind a cluster of trees. My heart thudded in my chest. I ran, breath burning my lungs, until I reached the gravel road. The mist made visibility low, but I could see the outline of a car in the distance. I waved frantically, shouting, hoping the driver could hear me. The car slowed and stopped beside me. The driver, a middle-aged man on his way home from a nearby village, looked concerned as I explained, gasping for breath. He offered to drive me back to Glasgow, and I accepted without hesitation. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw her standing at the edge of the clearing, watching the road disappear into the distance. Then she was gone, swallowed by the mist and trees. Back in Glasgow, I contacted the local police and gave a detailed description of the woman and the cabin. They checked the area and discovered that she had been living in abandoned parts of the forest for months, rarely seen by anyone, and was known to approach people in the area in ways that frightened them. The authorities were able to connect her to several missing persons reports, though none of them had come to serious harm, mostly because people managed to leave the area quickly, as I had. After that weekend, I never returned to the Highlands alone, but the experience stayed with me. The memory of her quiet, deliberate presence, the feeling of being watched in the dark, and the way the forest seemed to hide more than just trees. I realized that danger didn't have to be supernatural or dramatic. Sometimes, it was just a human being, unpredictable and terrifying, appearing when you least expected it. Now, whenever I plan a trip into isolated areas, I check my surroundings carefully, keep my phone and emergency supplies ready, and always stay aware of who or what might be out there. That weekend taught me that fear could come quietly, without warning, and sometimes the scariest moments are the ones that feel completely real. I never thought I'd end up in a place like that. It was the winter of 2018, and I had just turned 30. I had decided to take a few days off from work in Colorado, far from Denver's rush, and rent a small cabin in the mountains near Pagosa Springs. The cabin was remote, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that twisted through dense pines and frozen streams. I had gone there before in summer, but this time it was January, and snow draped over the trees like a thick white blanket. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I remember sitting by the small wood stove, the cabin smelling of pine and old furniture. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, and the snow settled in heavy layers. I could hear the creek nearby groaning as the ice shifted. At first, it was comforting. Solitude like this, I thought, was rare. The second day, I went for a hike along a trail that led to a ridge overlooking the valley. Snow had covered the trail, and I had to step carefully, making sure not to lose my footing. That's when I first noticed the tracks. They were large, like a dog's, but the shape was wrong. Too long, the toes stretched unnaturally. At first, I thought maybe it was a wolf or a coyote, but something about the stride felt wrong, too deliberate, too human. I shrugged it off, thinking my imagination was running wild. By the time I returned to the cabin, dusk had fallen, and the mountains were turning a deep blue. I stacked more wood into the stove and ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread. The night came quickly. That's when I heard it. At first, it was subtle, a crunching sound outside the cabin, faint but distinct. I froze trying to place it. The snow outside was deep, and anything walking on it made a loud noise. I told myself it was probably a deer or a coyote, but then I heard something else, a soft scraping like claws on wood. My stomach tightened. I checked all the locks and windows, all seemed secure. Still, the sound persisted, circling the cabin slowly, deliberately. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I could hear faint breathing outside, or maybe footsteps pacing in the snow. By early morning, I was so drained I stepped outside to clear my head. The snow was undisturbed on one side of the cabin, but near the trees, the tracks I had seen earlier had returned. Except now there were more, and these ones, they were different, human-like, tall, long arms, and clawed hands pressing deep into the snow. They led around the cabin, then stopped abruptly near the edge of the woods. I felt a cold dread seep into me, like the air itself had grown heavier. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling for help, but my phone had almost no signal. I was alone, miles from the nearest road. The third day, I decided to hike down the mountain to try and find better reception. I packed lightly, leaving some of my things in the cabin, thinking I would return later. The snow was thick, and the wind had picked up. Halfway down, I saw movement, a figure, crouched near a cluster of trees, watching me. It wasn't a deer. It didn't move like any animal I had seen. The shoulders hunched unnaturally, the head tilted at a strange angle. Its eyes caught mine for a brief moment. I could swear it was sizing me up. I didn't wait to analyze it. I ran, my boots cutting through snow, heart hammering, lungs burning. I barely noticed the trail I was supposed to follow. When I reached a flatter area near the road, I looked back. Nothing. The trees swayed, snow falling from branches. Maybe I had imagined it, but deep down I knew I hadn't. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I felt the cabin calling me back, like I had left something unfinished. I returned late that afternoon. The cabin seemed unchanged, but I felt its walls pressing in on me, suffocating somehow. I checked my things. Nothing was moved, nothing taken. But on the snow outside, around the cabin, the footprints had returned. More of them now and closer. I realized with a sinking stomach that whatever was out there had been watching me for the last 2 days. Waiting. The night that followed was the worst. I could hear something circling the cabin, low guttural noises, almost like growls, mixed with an uncanny mimicry of human breathing. I stayed close to the stove, knife in hand, flashlight under my chin. At some point, the sound shifted closer. I could see shadows moving beyond the window blinds. My heart felt like it would burst. The air was sharp with cold, but sweat ran down my spine. I tried to stay calm. I knew that making noise might attract it, but sitting still, frozen in fear, seemed equally dangerous. Hours passed. The creature or creatures didn't enter the cabin. They just lingered outside, circling, scratching, sniffing. I could see its elongated shadow flitting across the snow through the cracks in the walls. By morning, it was gone. The tracks led back into the forest, fading as they disappeared into the trees. I didn't stay to watch. I packed my things immediately. Every step I took down that road felt like I was leaving part of myself behind in that cabin. The wind had died down. Snow softened under my boots, but I didn't dare slow down until I reached a gas station in town, where I finally got signal. It took months for me to speak about it without feeling my throat tighten, without seeing that shadow in my mind. I later read about skinwalkers, Native American lore, mostly Navajo, descriptions of humans taking animal forms or something worse. At the time, I didn't care about the folklore. All I knew was what I saw, a being that wasn't human, and certainly not any animal I recognized. I never returned to that cabin. The owner tried to convince me it was just wildlife, coyotes or wolves, maybe someone trespassing, but I knew better. I could feel it in the way it moved, in the way it watched, and I knew, in a way that goes beyond logic, that it had been waiting for me. Years later, I learned that hikers in that area had reported strange sightings, humanoid figures slipping between the trees, sounds that didn't match any known animal. I never forgot those nights. Even now, when I drive past the mountains, I feel that same unease in my chest. The cabin is gone from my life, but the memory lingers. The feeling of being watched, hunted, and completely alone in the snow. That winter changed me. I learned that fear doesn't just exist in stories. Sometimes it exists in the silent steps outside your door, in shapes that defy explanation, and in the certainty that something is waiting, patient, observant, inhuman, just beyond the trees.